Terroir. I'm Simon Jacob, your host for this episode from Jerusalem. Before we get started, no matter where you are, please take a moment to pray for the safe return home of all our soldiers. If you're driving in your car, please focus on the road ahead. If you're relaxing at home, please open a delicious bottle of kosher wine and pour a glass, sit back, and relax. Okay, so let's try to picture this. It's Friday night. You've got guests around the table. The meal smells incredible, and you've decided to open something truly special. Maybe it's a bottle you've been saving for years, a flagship Yatir Forest, a beautiful high-end Herzog Generation 8, or a bold Domaine du Castel, Grand Vin. You paid a premium for it. You've been looking forward to this exact moment. You pull the cork, proudly pour a splash in your glass, swirl it, take a highly anticipated first sip, and nothing. Well, not exactly nothing, but instead of the lush, dark fruit and velvety finish the wine critics promised, it tastes tight. It feels sharp, almost aggressive on your palate. The fruit is hiding, and it tastes a bit like you're chewing on a wet grape stem or a bit of leather. Your heart sinks. You think, did I buy a bad bottle? Did I waste my money? Welcome back to the Kosher Terroir, the podcast where we explore the soil, the soul, and the science behind the world's greatest kosher wines. I'm your host, and today I'm here to tell you your bottle probably isn't bad. It's just asleep. Think about it from the wine's perspective. That liquid has been locked inside a dark, oxygen-starved glass tomb for 3, 5, maybe even 10 years. It has been living in a state of suspended animation. When you finally pull that cork, you aren't just opening a beverage. You're introducing a living, evolving thing to the atmosphere. And just like any of us waking up from a deep, long sleep in a stuffy room, you need to step outside, stretch your legs, and take a deep breath of fresh air. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the art and science of aeration. We are going to explore exactly what happens on a molecular level when oxygen finally meets wine. We'll discuss why some wines desperately need this process to unlock their true potential, while others will absolutely fall apart and die if you give them too much air. We will also draw a very important line between aerating a wine and decanting a wine, because while they often happen at the same time, they are actually two totally different things. And of course, we will walk through the many, many ways to get air into your wine. We'll start with the elegant classic swirl of a Bordeaux glass. Move on to those fancy plastic gadgets you see in the wine shops. And finally, we will discuss the controversial, almost terrifyingly modern practice of throwing your $80 bottle of Cabernet into a kitchen blender. Yes, you heard me right, a blender. So grab a glass, pour yourself a splash of something interesting, and whatever you do, don't drink it just yet. Give it a minute. Let's get started. So you've poured your wine. You've let it sit. But what is actually happening in that glass? It's time to put on our lab coats for a minute. Because the magic of aeration comes down to two very specific chemical reactions: evaporation and oxidation. Let's start with evaporation. When a wine is bottled, it's sealed tight. The winemaker wants to protect it from spoiling, so they limit its exposure to oxygen. In this oxygen-starved environment, a state winemakers call reduction, certain volatile compounds can build up. Have you ever opened a bottle of wine and the very first smell that hits you is a faint whiff of struck match, burnt rubber, or even garlic? That's not a flawed wine. That's what industry folks affectionately call bottle stink. It's just the buildup of sulfur compounds. When you pour that wine into a glass or a decanter and expose it to the air, those volatile sulfur compounds, along with some of the harsh alcohol vapors, the ethanol, rapidly evaporate. You are quite literally letting the bad air out. But evaporation is only half the story. The other half is oxidation. Now, usually oxidation is a dirty word in the wine world. If a wine is over-oxidized, it turns into vinegar. But a controlled amount of oxidation, that is exactly what we want. Think of a young, brooding Israeli Syrah or a massive Cabernet Sauvignon from the Upper Galilee. These wines are packed with tannins. Tannins are those naturally occurring compounds found in grape skins, seeds, and oak barrels. They are what gives red wine its structure, but they are also what causes that dry, astringent, mouth-puckering sensation, like leaving a tea bag in your mug for way too long. When oxygen interacts with these tannins, it causes them to link together into larger chains, a process called polymerization. As these chains get heavier, they actually soften the texture of the wine on your palate. The wine goes from feeling sharp and grippy to feeling round, velvety, and plush. And here's the beautiful payoff. As those harsh alcohols evaporate and those aggressive tannins soften, the wine opens up. The oxygen physically unlocks the esters, the chemical compounds responsible for the wine's fruit and floral aromas. Suddenly, that young, tight-closed wine that tasted like wet stems 5 minutes ago is now bursting with notes of ripe blackberry, dark chocolate, and crushed violets. You didn't change the wine. You just gave it the oxygen it needed to speak clearly. But like anything powerful, oxygen is a double-edged sword. While it can resurrect a closed-off wine, it can also destroy a delicate one. So we've covered a bit of the chemistry. Evaporation blows off the awkward bottle stink. The oxygenation starts linking those harsh tannin molecules together. But what does that actually feel like? What does it taste like when you're sitting at your Friday night table? Let me tell you a little bit of a story. A few years ago, I was hosting a big Yom Tov meal. I had been holding on to a beautiful, high-end, very young Israeli Petit Verdot. Petit Verdot is a grape known for being an absolute beast when it comes to tannins, dark, inky, and powerful. I brought the bottle to the table, popped the cork, and proudly poured a glass for my guest. He took a sip, smiled politely, and said, "Wow, that's big." I took a sip myself, and instantly my mouth felt like I had just chewed on a dry sponge. The wine was completely shut down. The tannins were so aggressive that they immediately bound to the proteins in my saliva, stripping all of the moisture from my mouth. It tasted like bitter, bitter dark chocolate and raw oak. I could feel the disappointment washing over the table. But I told everyone, just wait. Give it an hour. Ignore it. An hour later, we were clearing the table of the main course. I told my guest to try it again. He took a sip and his eyes widened. The wine had completely transformed. That sandpaper texture was gone. It had melted into liquid velvet. The bitterness had vanished, replaced by these incredible waves of dark plum, crushed violets, and a hint of sweet tobacco. He looked at me and asked, "Is this the same bottle?" That is the magic of aeration. When you properly aerate a wine that demands it, you are accomplishing two massive sensory upgrades. First, you are softening the blow. You are taking a wine that wants to wrestle with your palate and teaching it to dance instead. By allowing oxygen to polymerize or chain together those tannin molecules, they are becoming physically heavier. They stop feeling rough and start feeling plush. It's the difference between a harsh, angular drink and a luxurious mouth-coating experience. Second, you are executing a complexity reveal. When a big red wine is closed off, it's like listening to a symphony through a thick wall. You might hear the thumping bass, the primary fruit, maybe the heavy alcohol, but you're missing the violins and the woodwinds. As the wine breathes, oxygen acts like a key, unlocking chemical compounds called esters. Minute 1 in the glass, you smell alcohol and maybe some generic red berries. Minute 30, the alcohol blows off. You're now smelling ripe, black cherry and cedar. Minute 60, the wall comes down completely. Now you're getting the terroir, the earth, the roasted herbs, the leather, the baked spices. You're finally tasting the story the winemaker wanted to tell. Now, because this is the kosher terroir, we have to address a very specific, unique variable, the Mavushal factor. For those who might be new to this, a Mavushal wine is one that has been flash pasteurized. Decades ago, this meant literally boiling the wine, which cooked the fruit and destroyed the flavor. But modern technology is incredible. Today, wineries use a high-tech flash heating process. The wine is brought to a high temperature for just a fraction of a second, and then immediately flash cooled. It's so precise that even master sommeliers often can't tell the difference in a blind tasting. But here is the secret that a lot of people don't realize. Mavushal wines often need aeration even more than non-Mavushal wines. Think about the trauma the liquid just went through. It is flash heated, flash cooled, and then immediately shoved in a bottle and corked. It's in shock. It is aromatically muted. The fruit is wearing a straitjacket. I've seen it time and time again with incredible bottles like the Herzog Special Reserve Alexander Valley Cabernet or a premium Shiloh Secret Reserve. People pop the cork, pour a glass, and think it tastes a little flat or restrained. But if you give that Mavushal wine a vigorous swirl in a big glass, or put it in a decanter for 45 minutes, it's like giving it a warm hug. The oxygen wakes up those aromatics that the flash pasteurization temporarily puts asleep. It shakes off the shock and blossoms into a beautiful, expressive wine. So if air is this magical, fix-all ingredient, why wouldn't we just aerate every single bottle we own? Why not pour everything into a massive glass pitcher and leave it on the counter all day? Well, because wine is fragile. It's a living thing. And just like us, if you give a wine too much oxygen, it doesn't thrive, it dies. I said earlier that oxygen is a double-edged sword. It can resurrect a tightly coiled, aggressive young Cabernet and turn it into liquid velvet. But if you wield that sword recklessly, you will kill your wine. Let me paint another picture for you. Let's say you're celebrating a major milestone, a 40th anniversary, or a child's wedding. To mark the occasion, you went deep into your cellar or paid a premium at an auction for an aged masterpiece. Let's say a beautiful 2005 Yarden Katzrin. You've heard the golden rule. Always let a great bottle of red wine breathe. So you pull the long, fragile cork, carefully pour the entire bottle into a wide-bottomed glass decanter to impress your guests. And you leave it sitting on the dining room table for 2 hours while you're finishing the soup and fish courses. When it's finally time for the main course, you pour a glass, raise it for a toast, take a sip, and your heart breaks. The wine tastes like dusty potpourri. It's thin, it's metallic, and there's a distinct, sharp note of sour vinegar creeping in on the back of your throat. The beautiful fruit notes you paid hundreds of dollars for are completely and irreversibly gone. What happened? You over-aerated it. You loved it to death. Think of an old vintage wine like a fragile, elderly person who has been asleep in a dark, quiet room for 2 decades. When they finally wake up, you don't throw open the curtains, blast heavy metal music, and drag them into a treadmill. The shock would be too much. A wine that has spent 15 or 20 years in the bottle has already undergone a slow, microscopic, continuous form of oxidation through the porous cork. Its tannins have already softened. Its fruit has already evolved from fresh berries into dried figs and leather. The structural integrity of the wine is incredibly delicate. When you expose a wine like that to a massive rush of oxygen all at once, in a decanter especially, it rapidly accelerates the aging process. The wine will literally blossom and then die within 15 to 30 minutes. For older wines, pour them directly into the glass. Let them breathe for just a minute or two in the glass, and drink them while they are still holding on to their magic. And it's not just age that dictates fragility. We also have to talk about delicate varietals. Pinot Noir is famously called the heartbreak grape. It has incredibly thin skins, which means it naturally has fewer tannins and much lighter structure than a Cabernet or a Syrah. If you take a beautiful, delicate Pinot from, say, the Willamette Valley or a cooler climate in Israel, and you aggressively aerate it, you will blow right past those subtle, haunting aromas of fresh cherries and damp earth. You'll flatten the wine. The same goes for older rosés and very light-bodied reds. And finally, what about white wines and bubbles? Generally speaking, crisp, high-acid, white wines like Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio don't need aeration at all. They are built on freshness, and oxygen is the enemy of fresh. However, if you have a massive, oak-aged Chardonnay like a Castel C or Covenant Levan, those can actually benefit from 10 or 15 minutes of air to let the heavy oak notes integrate with the fruit. But champagne, or a beautiful kosher Prosecco or Cava, please, I'm begging you, do not aerate your sparkling wines. The entire magic of sparkling wine is the dissolved carbon dioxide, the bubbles. Those bubbles are actually carrying the aromatic compounds to your nose. When you swirl a glass of champagne vigorously, or heaven forbid decant it, you are just forcefully releasing the CO2. You are purposefully making your expensive champagne go flat, Pour it gently, leave it alone, and enjoy the fizz. So, we know why we aerate, and we know exactly when to keep the oxygen away. But for those robust heavy hitters, wines that desperately need air, how should we do it? Because as it turns out, just taking the cork out of the bottle and leaving it on the counter does basically nothing. So, you've got a massive brooding young Israeli Cabernet. You know it needs air. You pull the cork, you set the bottle on the kitchen counter, and you walk away for an hour. You come back, pour a glass, and it still tastes like wet gravel and sandpaper. Why? Because simply pulling the cork and leaving the bottle opened does almost nothing. Think about the geometry of the bottle. The neck is barely 3/4 of an inch wide. The amount of wine actually touching the air is microscopic compared to the 750 milliliters of liquid trapped underneath it. Leaving the cork out lets the wine breathe, but it's like trying to ventilate a mansion through a single keyhole. If you want to aerate wine, you need one thing above all else: surface area. You have to get the wine out of the glass prison. Let's walk through the methods, starting from the most elegant and traditional and ending with something that might get you kicked out of your local wine tasting group. Method number 1, the glass swirl. I know you've seen people do this. Yes, sometimes it looks a little pretentious. But swirling your wine isn't a nervous tic. It's a vital mechanical action. When you swirl, you are sloshing the wine up the sides of the glass, drastically increasing the surface area and forcing oxygen into the liquid. It literally vaporizes those aromatic esters we talked about, sending them right up to your nose. But here's the secret. The glass matters. A big tannic Bordeaux blend needs a tall glass with a wide bowl that tapers at the top, trapping those bold aromas. A delicate Pinot Noir needs a burgundy glass, which looks almost like a goldfish bowl, because it gives maximum surface area to the delicate wine, gently collecting its subtle, haunting nose. So, pour a few ounces, give it a good vigorous swirl on the table, and let it sit for a few minutes. Method number 2, the standard decanter. If swirling is a gentle breeze, a decanter is a gust of wind. A decanter is simply a glass vessel designed to maximize the wine-to-air ratio. When you have a massive, structured wine, maybe a young French Bordeaux or a young Domaine du Castel Grand Vin, you want a decanter with a very wide flat base. You want the wine spread out as thin and wide as possible. But what if we're serving an older, fragile wine? Remember, we don't want to aerate those, but we do want to separate the wine from the gritty sediment that's collected in the bottle over the decades. In that case, what you want to use is a narrow decanter. You pour it very gently, leaving the sediment in the bottle, but limiting the surface area so that the old wine doesn't die of oxygen shock. That is the crucial difference between aerating, exposing to air, and decanting, separating sediment. Method number 3, the gadgets. Walk into any wine shop and you'll see a wall full of plastic aerators. Brands like Venturi are famous for this. They look like little plastic funnels that you hold over your glass while you pour. Do they work? Well, actually, yes. They use something called the Venturi effect, which is basic fluid dynamics. As the wine rushes through the narrow neck of the funnel, it speeds up, creating a vacuum that actively sucks air through the little holes on the side. That's why it makes that loud gurgling sound. It violently forces oxygen into the wine in a matter of seconds. It's perfect for a Tuesday night when you just want one glass of that tight Mavushal Cabernet and don't have an hour to wait. Method number 4, the double decant. Now, let's say it's Friday night. You want the wine to breathe, but you also spent a lot of money on a beautiful, heavy, gold-foiled bottle, and you want your guests to see the label. You don't want to serve it out of a plain glass pitcher. The double decant. 2 hours before the meal, pour the wine into a decanter. Let it breathe. While it's sitting there, rinse the empty bottle with a little water to wash out any sediment. Then, right before your guests arrive, simply use a funnel to pour the aerated wine back into the original bottle. The wine gets double the air exposure from being poured twice, and you get to present the beautiful bottle at the table. An actual win-win. Method number 5, hyperdecanting. Yes, I'm completely serious. A few years ago, Nathan Meyerwold, the brilliant scientist and author behind the modernist cuisine cookbooks, introduced the wine world to hyperdecanting. The method is simple. You open a bottle of red wine, dump the entire thing into a kitchen blender, and run it on high for 30 to 60 seconds. I know traditionalists are screaming at the radio right now. It sounds sacrilegious. It looks horrifying. The wine turns into a frothy, purple opaque smoothie. But here's the wild, undeniable truth. For certain types of wines, it works miraculously well. If you have an incredibly stubborn, tightly coiled, unapologetically massive young wine, the kind of wine that would normally need to sit in the decanter for 6 hours just to be drinkable, the blender accomplishes that in 30 seconds. The sheer mechanical force violently introducing oxygen to every single molecule of the liquid instantly softens the tannins and explodes the aromatics. Once the froth settles, you pour it into a glass, and it's beautifully, perfectly open. However, listen carefully. Only do this to extremely big, bold, young reds. If you put a delicate Pinot, or heaven forbid a 15-year-old vintage Bordeaux into a blender, you will commit first-degree murder. You will completely destroy it. But for that $30 unyielding, young, heavily oaked Mavushal cab, bring out the Vitamix. Your guests will think you're crazy right up until they take their first sip. Okay, so we've covered the science, and we've covered the gadgets, and we've covered the kitchen blender. But how do you actually apply all of this to your own table this Friday night? It's time for this week's Kosher Terroir tasting tip. I want to give you a fun, interactive experiment to try with your guests this Shabbat. I call it the interval test. Here's what you do. Take a young, high-quality, full-bodied red wine, maybe a beautiful Judean Hills blend or a robust Cabernet. Right before you sit down for the meal, pop the cork. Now pour just one small tasting portion into each of their glasses and set them aside. Then pour the rest of the bottle into a decanter or simply use your Venturi aerator to pour a second glass right next to the first one. Now gather your guests around. I want everyone to smell and taste the first glass, the one that came straight from the bottle with zero air. Pay attention to how it feels. Is it tight? Is it a little sharp on the back of your tongue? Are the aromas kind of muted? Then taste the aerated glass. You will immediately notice the difference. But here is where the fun really begins. Don't drink it all at once. Set a timer in your head and have everyone take a tiny sip from the aerated glass every 15 minutes for the first hour of the meal. What you are doing is tracking the wine's evolution in real time. You are watching the oxygen do its work. At minute 15, maybe the alcohol burn fades. At minute 30, maybe the dark cherry notes suddenly pop out of nowhere. At minute 45, the texture might shift completely from coarse to silky. Every single wine has a sweet spot, that perfect window of time where the oxygen has opened up all the aromas, but hasn't yet started to flatten the fruit. The interval test teaches your palate how to find that sweet spot. It turns drinking wine into an active, engaging experience rather than just washing down your food. Speaking of food, let's talk about how aeration changes your pairings, specifically for classic Shabbat dishes. Think about a classic, slow-roasted fatty brisket. When you pair a red wine with a heavy, fatty piece of meat, you need tannins. The fat coats your tongue, and the tannins act like a squeegee, scraping that fat away and cleansing your palate for the next bite. But if you serve a massive, aggressive, unaerated wine with that brisket, those harsh, tightly coiled tannins will fight the food. The bitterness of the young wine will actually overpower the savory, rich flavors of the meat. However, if you give that same wine an hour of air, those tannins polymerize. They soften. Suddenly, the wine isn't fighting the brisket. It's dancing with it. The plush, velvety texture of the aerated wine perfectly complements the tender, melting texture of the meat, while the unlocked acidity cuts right through the fat. Aeration doesn't just make the wine taste better. It makes your entire meal taste better. And just like that, we've reached the bottom of the bottle for today's episode. We've covered a lot of ground today. We took a deep dive into the microscopic chemistry of evaporation and oxidation. We learned how oxygen can rescue a closed-off, aggressively tannic young Cabernet, and how it can breathe life back into a shell-shocked Mavushal wine. We also learned how to wield the power carefully so that we don't accidentally murder a delicate 20-year-old vintage or flatten our favorite champagne. Whether you decide to gently swirl a burgundy glass, invest in a fancy Venturi aerator, or terrify your guests by throwing a bottle into a kitchen blender, I want you to walk away with one key takeaway. Aeration is a tool, not a rule. You are the master of your own table. Listen to the wine, taste it as it evolves, and figure out exactly what it needs to shine. Before we wrap up, I want to send a huge, heartfelt thank you to listener Jonathan Jacob. Jonathan reached out and explicitly suggested this week's deep dive into the mechanics of aeration. Jonathan, thank you for the brilliant prompt. I hope this episode makes the wine at your next Shabbat table taste a whole lot better. And to the rest of you listening, I want to hear from you too. The Kosher Terroir is an ongoing conversation. If there is a topic, a specific winery, or a wild wine myth you want me to unpack, reach out and let me know. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do me a favor. Just like a great bottle of wine, this podcast is meant to be shared. Send this episode to the person who usually hosts you for Friday night dinner. Text it to your wine-loving friends And please take 30 seconds to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It is the absolute best way to help new listeners discover the show and to grow our incredible community. Join us again next week. And until then, pour yourself something beautiful and remember, wine is a living thing. Sometimes it just needs a little room to breathe. L'chaim, everyone, have a wonderful week. This is Simon Jacob again, your host of today's episode of the Kosher Terroir. Please subscribe via your podcast provider to be informed of our new episodes as they are released. If you're new to the Kosher Terroir, please check out our many past episodes.